Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about obstruction. What do I mean with obstruction? Well, I'm referring to the idea of placing one of our pieces in the way for the opponent's pieces. For example, we block one of their bishops with a knight along a diagonal, or if they have a rook on an open file, we could perhaps put a bishop on that file so that the rook is not as powerful as before. Please notice that there is another situation, which we will come to later in this course, when we are blocking one of the opponent's pawns, and that's what I'm referring to as a blockade. But here mainly we're talking about restricting the opponent's pieces by using our pieces. Let's have a look at the first example, which would make this picture a little more clear. So here we have a game between, with white pieces, Yakuboyev, and playing black is Sivuk. You can see that white is playing for an attack. They have managed to install a rook on the 7th rank, and a closer look reveals that there is actually a concrete threat here. What do you think white is up to? Aha, that's right. The g7 pawn is a bit exposed at this point, and white would like to play something like knight e6. In this case, they would be threatening mate in 1, and at the same time you can see that we could not take on e6, because in that case obviously the rook is undiscovered there, and white would take on g7. So what do you think black should do about that? Should they try to prevent knight e6 in some way, or is there some other solution? Aha, this is not a very difficult example. Black has a simple path to neutralizing white's attack. In the game, Sivuk hurried to give check on d1, and after king h2, he placed the queen on g4. So this is what I refer to with obstruction. We don't let white's queen exert pressure on the g file anymore. It has been neutralized by the black queen. You can see that there is also some kind of connection between obstruction and defensive exchanges. If we're using a piece of the same value as a queen versus a queen or a bishop versus a knight, then we are in fact offering some kind of exchange, trade. So there is a clear connection between these two ideas. We will come to that later. So at this point you can see that it's not so easy for white to do anything here, because also black is obviously targeting the pawn on h4. So in the game, Yakuboyev simply traded on g4, and after h takes g4, white didn't have much of an advantage. I would even say that black is happy to have the bishop in this endgame. After rook e2, rook b8, black had no real problems here. So very simple example. You can see that from the very beginning here, white had an obvious threat. They would like to play knight e6. In fact, there is also a second threat, more elegant. They could try to play queen takes g7 check, and after king takes g7, they would have knight e6 followed by knight takes d4, some kind of move order trick, you could say. However, black, there are other options, but black had a very simple option here. Simply check and obstruct white on the g file. With this, definitely white's attack is over. So very simple. Let's have a look at a more complex example. By coincidence, it's also taking place on the g file. We have a game here between, with the white pieces, Swedish strong grandmaster Nils Gandelius, and playing black is David Howell, very strong grandmaster also from England. As you can see, white here has sacrificed a whole piece in order to start a strong attack. All their pieces are basically participating in this attack. Please don't forget that they have this nice sniper bishop on a2. And you can see that the queen on d2 is about to take on h6, which would be mate in this case, right? So what do you think black should do about that? How could they somehow save the skin here for their king? Well, it's certainly not easy. We will have to try to protect that pawn somehow. In the game, Howell played the obvious move, knight g8. Unfortunately, this defends the pawn on h6, but at the same time, it lets white take the pawn on e5, and that's what Grandelius did in the game. He played knight takes e5. You can see that now there are a bunch of different ideas here. We have threats like, for example, knight g6, taking advantage of the pressure along the e file. Black tried queen b4, and here Grandelius found a very nice move. I'll give you a hint. It's not a queen move, all right? It's not a check, and it's not a queen move. So could you find a good move which is not with a queen and which also doesn't give check? Aha, we have a very strong threat here. White played the move rook f3. Extremely pretty move, as you can see. We are about to deliver mate on f7. Black was in big trouble here. They tried in the game f5. in order to avoid that mate. But as you can see now, this square on g6 is suddenly available for white's knight. White simply took on before, and after knight g6, in the end the rook fell off and white went on to win here after king g7, rook takes e8. So this is what happened in the game, but there was a much better option here. I wanted to mention that sometimes these obstructive ideas, they are carried out in the shape of a sacrifice, and that's what could have happened here. Black could have sealed the g-file. They could have tried to obstruct white's rook along the g-file in the shape of a sacrifice. So I think by now you know which move I'm talking about, because we also have to keep track of this pawn and keep track of that pawn. So which move might that be, combining all these ideas? Exactly, knight g4. We cannot blame Howell for omitting this move because it's not very obvious. It's a typical move that the chess engine will tell us about afterwards, but we can certainly learn from this kind of idea. So knight g4, black gives back a knight here, a piece, in order to neutralize white's attack a little. After h takes g4, the move that black hurry to play here, or they should hurry to play here because there is the threat of queen takes h6, is queen g5. And as you can see, again, we're using some kind of obstruction. This time we're obstructing white on the c1 h6 diagonal. This would mean that black is having much less problems with their king at this moment. White will have to spend the tempo on moving the queen because they don't want to trade queens, of course. They could play something like queen d3, but after that it's time for us to bring out our pieces. Good move would be here bishop e6, so that we pin the knight along the a2 g8 diagonal. And black would be perfectly fine in this position. It's a complex position. There is a lot of tactics going on here, but safe to say the king is feeling much better now than before. Yeah, many interesting variations here to calculate. Could they take on e5? Maybe we have queen c1. There is something with bishop takes e4, but there is queen a3. Yeah, many things to analyze, but if you're in a game situation, you can't analyze everything. You have to at some point also assess. You have to make some kind of assessment. And here you could assess that no matter what happens, at least my king is a bit better protected now. Another thing that I wanted to touch upon is, after this very nice move, knight g4, white could of course insist. They could insist with rook takes g4, trying to keep the battle going on the g-file. So maybe actually Howell, he noticed knight g4, but he didn't like rook takes g4. That's another obvious theory, because if you look carefully here, you can see that if we take on g4, white would take on h6, and after king g8, at this point of the battle, white is a whole rook down, but after rook takes e5, it's actually very difficult to save black here. You can see that rook g5 is coming up next. So maybe this is what he didn't like. But if we go back to the position after rook takes g4, there is a very simple move. We're not forced to take back on g4. As I mentioned before, sometimes these non-recaptures, they are difficult for us chess players. When the opponent has just taken something, like in this case, if they play rook takes g4, it's our natural reaction to take back. However, in the tactical battle, that can sometimes be a wrong choice. So here, black has a very simple move. We can now protect the pawn on h6 with our queen, because as you see, the knight... Sorry, I will repeat this again, but I wanted you to notice just one thing here. After knight g4, we are actually also making space for the queen, so to speak. It's a helpful move in that sense. So now we can play queen f6. Maybe, just maybe, this is what black didn't notice in the game, that they could simply bring the queen a little closer so that the pawn on h6 is protected, and at the same time we have some more support of the pawn on e5. So this wouldn't be that bad for black. Material is about equal, I think. And yeah, black is fairly active in this position. For starters, the rook is hanging. They will have to move the rook somewhere. And I think the best move here was to just push the pawn. Before white gets a chance to play rook f3, we should play e4. And unclear position, I would say. Anything can happen here, but safe to say, black's king is feeling much better now than at the beginning here of this example. So interesting idea, knight c4. We are giving away a knight in order to obstruct white in their attack along the g-file. Okay, let's continue speaking about giving away pieces on an open file for defensive purposes. There is one example which I simply had to include in this course. It's featuring two of my favorite players with white pieces. We have Mark Taimanov and playing black, Bent Larsen. I'm a really happy reader of their books, and I think this one appeared in Larsen's book, his best games. So what has happened in this game? You can see that we have two true optimists in this game. Both Taimanov and Larsen were famous for believing very much in their own plans and never, how would you say, never retreat. They will always go for the full point and so on. So they're facing each other, and for that reason, it's obviously going to be a very interesting game. You can see that Taimanov sacrificed the exchange in order to reach this position. You can see that Black's king is exposed along the g file. If White could bring their queen over to g3, it would be game over. So it's Black's turn here. Black had different moves. One move they could have considered is something like rook c8, trying to pin the knight, but Larsen went all in and he played here the move f6, which by coincidence also the chess engine likes this move. So what happens here is that Taimanov had something prepared, a very beautiful move, sacrifice, another sacrifice, which is knight e4. So wow, this is really amazing how White sacrifices so many pieces in there, but you can see there is a clear idea. White would like to play queen g3, and at the same time you can see that since the knight left, there is also an option of bringing the rook to c7. So basically all White's pieces would be participating in this attack. So Larsen is in a difficult situation here. He has to be very careful. For example, we cannot take on e4, because in that case White will take on e6, and as you can see, the attack is playing by itself here. So after knight e4, Larsen went all in again. He played f takes e5. So what's going on here? Can Black simply take like that? Isn't queen g3 a very annoying move? You can see that now after king h8, queen takes e5, the king will have to go back, White will take on e6, they have perhaps, at minimum, they have a draw, but if they can bring in the other rook, I mean the rook that they have left, then things would be very critical for Black. So what's going on here? It's not clear. I tried this position on students also. Some of them wanted to play king f7 here, trying to bring the king towards the center, but as I think Larsen explained in his book, his great book, after knight g5 and queen takes e5, White will have a very strong attack because they're attacking the bishop on e6, and also we have these ideas with rook c7 and queen g7. So this would be very dangerous. So what to do then? If we can't play king h8 due to queen takes e5, and we can't play king f7, are there really more moves to consider? Well, we're a rook up, and this chapter is called Obstruction, where we are putting pieces in the way for the opponent's pieces, even in the form of a sacrifice. So by now, of course, you know what Larsen played. Fantastic move. I mean, most of us could find it at the board at this very moment, but to visualize it in your calculation a few moves before this, that's very impressive in my opinion. So bishop g4, fantastic move by Larsen. What he has noticed is that when White takes on g4, well, then the queen is not able to take on e5 anymore. So now we can safely play king h8. So this is what happened in the game. Taimanov tried here knight g5, trying to keep up the attack, but at this point Larsen has a very nice move in a counter-attacking spirit. So can you find some kind of counter threat here for Black? Maybe you remember the chapter about counter threats. Is there any way in which we can attack a few of the opponent's pieces? Aha, that's right. Queen d2, very strong move. We are attacking the rook, and we are also about to take on f2. In the very worst case scenario, we could try to trade queens on g2. And that explains also why Larsen didn't use up this move h2. Perhaps you thought about this move. We could use it at some point, but if we keep the pawn on h3, we actually keep more flexibility because it gives us additional options such as taking, or like we are discussing here, if we could bring the queen to f2, we would actually take and we would force the exchange of queens. Something like that happened in the game. If White plays rook f1, that would mean that rook is not active anymore in the attack, and Black could simply take on d4. If White tries to give mate, we can use the queen to cover this important pawn, playing queen d3. So for that reason, after queen d2, Taimanov preferred to go all in with rook c7. However, as you can see, Black can now simply trade queens. This is a good moment for that. After queen takes f2, king h2, queen takes g2, queen takes, pawn takes. Material is already much favorable for Black. White gets a few pawns, but it won't be enough. After d takes e5, Larsen simply played rook ac8, bringing more pieces to the battle. After rook takes b7, they could also take on h7, but it wouldn't be a big difference. Without queens on the board, there isn't really much of an attack for white. Rook takes b7, and after rook c2, Larsen started his counterattack, knight f7, and I like the next move. It's perhaps very basic, but I like it. He played simply here king g7, because he knew that there was no good discovered attack for white here. Taimanov tried e6, and after king f6, we're about to take that pawn on e6. After e7, Taimanov is trying his last cards, trying to get to some drawn, well, not drawn, but some rook endgame with drawing chances, I was going to say. But Larsen noticed something here. We're back in the chapter about intermediate moves. We will take the knight on f7, but not now, when white can reach rook endgame. So we should use a few intermediate moves. So how could you use two intermediate checks in a row here and then take the knight? Aha, that's right. We can use the g-pawn, and after g1 queen, king takes, we are ready to give another check with rook g8. And at this point, Taimanov resigned, because after king takes next turn, black is simply a rook up. So very, very nice example. I have seen this example a long time ago, and I still remember it. Every time I see this kind of situation on the board, when you give away a piece like that in obstructive fashion in order to deflect your opponent's pieces, I remember this example. It's one of my key references in this area. Unexpected moves. I read somewhere that somebody said that one of the things that chess players don't like, let's continue. I mean, let's see again what happened here. f6, knight e4, f takes e5, queen g3. So one of the things supposedly that we don't like so much is to let our opponent take our pieces with a check. It seems that's some kind of taboo that we have. We don't like that. But of course, Larsen was playing at a different level. He had no issues with such things. Bishop g4, very nice move. Again, repeating this, but it's important to understand. You can find this at the board when you sit here at this very position, but to see it in your preliminary calculations, like at this point, for example, to be able to see this here, f6, knight f4, f takes e5, queen g3 check, bishop g4, and understand it, that's really high-level calculation, in my opinion. All right, we will continue. Let's have a look at our next example. We will now turn our attention to the H file. We have seen a few examples featuring the G file, but now I would like to focus a little more on the H file. So let's have a look at this game with the white pieces Baghdasaryan and playing black Gabouzian. Very double-edged position. You can see that white is a pawn up. They have the bishop pair, but black has just played a move queen c5. And we are actually back now in chapter 1. What is black up to here? What is black's threat? Maybe very simple, you will say. Of course, they want to mate us. Black has an idea here, typical idea in some structures, in some openings. Play knight g3, and after h takes g3, h takes g3, it will be mate along the h file. So how could white fight against this plan? What could we do about it? Well, one move that you could consider here is to play bishop e3. In this way, the king gets access to this square. Unfortunately, we are giving away our bishop pair here, which I don't like so much. So black will probably take on e3, and they can maybe take on d5 after trading the queens. Trading queens is good for black here because their king is a little unsafe, right? So they're happy to trade queens, and then they could take on d5, and the opposite color bishops would greatly favor black here because it makes a draw more likely. So this is not enough for white. They are looking for something more promising. And yeah, white found a very nice move here. You have to use a little tactical trick. You have to use some possibility aimed at black's king also in order to find white's next move. But I will give you a hint. We need a piece to block the rook on h8. We need some piece who can obstruct the rook along the h file. And there aren't many pieces which are capable of that. Aha, you got it. Very sneaky move, bishop d7. What's going on? Well, in the first place, black cannot take, because in that case, as you can see, we are going to mate them. Rook d8, and we could just take, and in the end, we are mating them on e8. So that's not possible. On the other hand, if black plays knight g3, which indeed occurred in the game, now you can see the point. White can take, well, they have to take, and then they can put the bishop on h3. So this was white's deep idea when playing bishop d7. Very interesting idea. In this way, their king is definitely safe. Right now, white is a whole piece up, so they should be winning. Anyway, black is trying their chances here. Gabouzian played queen takes d5. Now, let's not be too greedy. If we take on e7, perhaps we are already imagining that black will take and we will play some nice trick like rook e8, rook takes, queen takes, and things like that. Then we are mistaken. We have to look at the whole board. Please notice that this pawn on g2 is pinned. So, of course, black will take rook. They will take on h3. I mean, rook takes h3, and it's another story now. So that has to be avoided. In the game, Baghdasaryan played a much nicer move. He traded off the bishop on e7 by playing here bishop b4. Very technical in this way. White keeps their extra piece, and after bishop takes, rook takes with this rook, of course, so that we don't run into this trick again. We are about to play rook bd4. We have an extra rook, so white, extra piece, so white should be completely winning. So nice example. We're using this little tactical twist, bishop d7, to bring the bishop to h3 in order to seal the h-file, to block black's rook along the h-file. So let's have a look at another example on the h-file. As you can see, this time the bishop landed on h3 by means of a sacrifice, but once it reached h3, it was there to stay. On the other hand, in our next example, you will see that the way in which white obstructs black on the h-file, it will be in a much more, what can I say, surprising way. Because here, in this game between with the white pieces Leon Valdez and playing black Santos Ruiz, black has just played here the move bishop c5. You can see that this is really dangerous for white, because what black is up to here is that they would like white to take on c5, they will take on e4, and after white takes back on e4, they will of course bring the queen to the attack, something like queen h3 and trying to mate white in this way. If we take first, well, you can see that there are other ideas, such as if queen takes c5, black would play queen f3, and then we would have again a mating picture on the h-file. So white is definitely on thin ice here. They have to be very careful. In the game, white did what we should always do. They considered the acceptance of the sacrifice. So in the game, white played queen takes c5. If you play instead bishop takes f5, as we were talking about, it would be great to trade queens, of course, but again, as I just mentioned, queen takes f5 will let let black play queen f3, or perhaps even queen h3. This would be very dangerous for white. You can also see that there is no way we can play something like this, because in that case it's the pawn on f2 which is hanging, and it's even mate at this point. So that's completely impossible. Also, if you play something like queen d3, this means that black would bring the queen to the h-file. They would play here queen h6, and again, very dangerous. So that's one merit of this move, bishop c5, that they're also targeting the pawn on f2. So dangerous. What happened in the game? White took on c5 because they noticed that after bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, queen h3, there is actually a way to obstruct black along the h-file. Yeah, there can't be many ways, right? You're completely right. We have to give away the rook for that purpose. Rook h4. Very clever, because with this sacrifice, white gains time for their own counterattack. So after g takes h4, you can see that now black is material up. There is the devastating threat of h takes g3, but it's white's turn. And I think you can guess what white played here, right? If white really wants to attack, what do you think they should play? Exactly, that's a nice move. e6. All our pieces are happy about this move. You can see the bishop is now hitting the rook. The pawn would like to take. The rook, the white rook, I mean, it gets the e-file to work on and so on. So that's a very powerful move. If h takes g3, white could take on f7, and after king takes queen c4, white will have many checks here, and they are probably not in any danger at all. It's rather black who should be careful. Now you can imagine maybe if queen e6, maybe queen f4, and so on. We can pick up this pawn with check perhaps, or we can also take the rook at our convenience. So after e6, black castle long instead. At this point, it's interesting that there are actually two moves that white can use to save this game, but one is much nicer than the other. The computer won't care about it. It will say that both are fine, but human-wise, there is one which requires much less calculation. So that's the one that I will also prefer here. Queen takes a7, very clever, because white has seen that there is a perpetual coming up now. Thanks to this little pawn, we won't let them escape along the light squares. Queen takes a7, that's what Leon Valdez played in the game. after h takes e3, he was ready to deliver a perpetual here by queen a8, king c7, and queen a5. Yeah, we should not give check on e5. This looks tempting at first sight. However, after king b6, suddenly our checks are over. So we should give check on a5 instead. This means that black will have to go back, and we will just carry out this perpetual, and the game is a draw. By coincidence, we could also take on h8, but again, we're in this discussion about human thinking and the computer thinking, so to speak. You could take here and you can get away with it, but it's a crazy variation. H takes e3, e takes f7, and it's funny that black cannot profit from this situation. You would say something like this and that, but the king escapes, and there are some tactical details there. But yeah, in my opinion, completely crazy to play this with white when you have such an easy way out here. Queen takes, preparing a perpetual with the queen. So yeah, that's my personal belief, at least. Going back to the beginning of this example, you can see that white was really in a difficult situation. Black had plans of mating them. However, by means of this very nice trick, obstructive trick, rook h4, we gain a very important tempo. Temporarily, black is blocking themselves on the h file, and that means that we have time for our own counterattack. Yeah, very nice. Very nice example. I was just thinking if castles, but then, okay, then we have queen g5. Yeah, so no way they should castle short here. Interesting. All right, let's continue. Let's take another example. I think this one is not about files anymore. Now we're talking diagonals. So let's see. This example is about diagonals. You can see that we have a typical IQP structure here. White is playing for an attack. They have lined up their pieces in quite a good way with a queen on a very nice square on h3. And the bishops are directed at black's king also. So black should be very careful here. You can see that if it's white to move, probably bishop g5 will be an interesting move, because in that way we are fighting against the knight on f6. There will be threats such as knight takes, and after queen takes, we could take on f6, and perhaps queen takes h7 will be possible in the end. So what do you think black should do about that? Yeah, don't even think about h6. That would be like sending an invitation card to bishop takes h6. Yeah, don't do that. Well, I haven't calculated this, but it looks dangerous, something along these lines. I was taught that when you play the IQP structure with black, you should be very careful with this move, because sometimes you need to play this move, g6, and for that reason you should not have a hanging pawn on h6. In any case, this discussion is not necessary, it's not relevant, because black has something much better here. And those of you who have seen Petrosyan's games, you will remember a pattern here, because he had a very nice game against Simagin many years ago, of course, where he used a similar idea. Black can trade off white's most powerful bishop, or at least neutralize this bishop. I'm talking about the bishop on d3. So how do you think we could somehow challenge that bishop? How could we obstruct the bishop along the b1, h7 diagonal? That's right. For that to happen, first we should eliminate the knight on c3, and after white takes back, no matter how they take back, let's say they take with the pawn, we would then play the key move here, bishop e5 in Petrosyan spirit. Once we do that, we can now take a sigh of relief, because white's attack is not that strong anymore once we bring our bishop, because they can of course decline the trade of bishops. They could play something like bishop e2, but then we have the bishop on this side, so it's a different story. Oh, by the way, you will of course say that that's impossible because the bishop is hanging. Yeah, you're right. But I'm just talking in strategical terms, that even if white could decline the trade of bishops, that would be good news for black, because the bishop would join the kingside defense. So in the game, yeah, this happened in another game, by the way. There was a game like that. White played bishop g5, and after bishop takes d3, knight takes d3, rook c8. Black was fine in this game between Richter and Kollars. Anyway, in our game, after bishop takes c3, yeah, I forgot to tell you who's playing in this game with the white pieces. Moldavian Grandmaster Iordachescu, and playing black is Jumabayev, a strong grandmaster from Kazakhstan, if I'm not mistaken. So after bishop takes c3, Iordachescu took with the bishop on c3, and here Jumabayev hurried to play bishop e4. There is one little thing that I wanted to also discuss with you here. We are putting the bishop on e4, which means that we are automatically challenging the bishop on d3. But you could claim that why couldn't we put a knight there instead, so that we keep our strong bishop? Well, In that case, my piece of advice would be to consider that when we put a bishop on a square where it's exposed to an enemy knight, or vice versa, we put a knight, as in this case, where it's exposed to an enemy bishop, that will lead to greater flexibility for our opponent. Because if you think about all the pieces, if a queen is attacking a queen, like in our first example, Sivuk's game, queen versus queen, then both queens can take each other, right? The same goes for the rooks. Now, if there are two rooks on the same file, both of them can take. However, a bishop and a knight, only one of the sides can take. And in this case, you can see that it's white who can take on e4 at their leisure. Black cannot take on d3. That's not the way the knight moves, so to speak. And the same goes if it was the other situation where it's the knight who can take a bishop and the bishop cannot take the knight. Let's imagine that this bishop didn't exist. Then it's black who has this extra possibility. So we should be careful about this. If we put our knight here, it gives white greater flexibility. They can capture something that we cannot capture. So I looked a little at this because I wanted to figure out if there was really a big difference. And what I saw here, I think it was perhaps not me, but rather Stockfish, is that white could play a very promising pawn move here. Those of you who play the IQP positions with white, you know which is the favorite pawn move in such structures. Of course, white just loves to play d5 in this structure. So what's going on here? How on earth can white play d5? Well, there are some complex tactical variations here, but basically what we're trying to do here, we exploit the pin along the h3 c8 diagonal. Black cannot take like that because then the knight is hanging. They can certainly not move the knight because then they are getting mated. And if they take with the bishop, you can see that the merit of this plan, apart from unblocking the bishop, it also means that we open up the d file for our tactical purposes, right? So we would take, we would put the rook on d1. I would go with this rook probably. Pin now, the knight is pinned, and if they go back, you can of course see what white would play. Of course, we're speaking about pins. Don't worry, there is a chapter about pins later on, using pins, where we will see more pins. Rook takes d5 is a very strong move, and after pawn takes, knight takes d7. This is already resignable for black. If queens were not on, black would probably be okay, but in the presence of queens, their king is just too exposed here. You can see that apart from knight takes, we have queen g3 coming up with very strong pressure on the dark squares, specifically the g7 pawn. So yeah, this has to be avoided. Why did this happen? Because after bishop takes e3, black put the knight on e4, which means greater tactical flexibility for white, because they can take on e4 and we cannot. So for that reason, much better what Jumabai played in the game, bishop e4. So actually at this point, the game is not, I would say, that interesting anymore as for the defensive context, because after this, black is completely equalizing and perhaps even taking over. White didn't want to take on e4. In that case, you can see that this is a nice middle game for black. The IQP is not really compensated by anything here. So in the game, after bishop e4, Iordachescu played bishop e2 instead, keeping the bishop well. There followed knight takes e5, d takes e5. Now white doesn't have the IQP anymore. However, after knight e5, black has plenty of piece activity. You can see that this is one idea, that's another idea. And of course, we should not rule out some capture on c3 at some point if black likes to, bring in the rook and the queen and so on. So what happened here? Well, white played queen g3. In order to prevent knight f4, black hurried to take on c3. I think if we take with the queen now, I think rook c8 will be troublesome. Again, we're talking about this, we're talking a little about that also. Sometimes positions with the space advantage, as in this case, white has some extra space, they become a bit exposed when there are not many pieces left on the board. It's difficult for white to keep track of all the squares that black would like to invade on and so on. So in the game, white took with the pawn instead, but black played queen d2 anyway, and they had a nice initiative at this point. So what we have seen here is that white's bishop was very strong on the b1 h7 diagonal, but black hurried to play before white gets rook e1 in, for example, or bishop g5. They hurry to take on c3, and then they put the bishop on e4. Very important. This was a good piece, of course, the bishop, but as they say, don't think too much about what leaves, think about what stays on the board. So this is a very nice trade. We're trading off their key bishop on d3. All right, we should continue. Let's look at a similar example, but with the opposite colors, so to speak. In this more recent game between Grandmaster Kovalenko with white and Grandmaster Nexans playing black. We have a very complex battle. You can see that white's last move, well, I'm telling you that white's last move was f4. White is going all in on the king side. Plenty of white pieces in the attack. You can see that the bishop is eyeing the g7 pawn indirectly, and also the rook would very much like to clear the f-file for, tactical means. There is even a concrete threat here. If you look carefully, you will see that there is something like this. Pawn takes, and knight h6, trying to bring the knight to f7. So black has plenty to think about here, and this was actually a blitz game, but even so, Nexans understood what he should do here. He should try to obstruct this bishop on b2, this powerful bishop. So that's what he did in the game. He played at this point bishop c5 check, not so much for the check, but in order to put something on d4, king h1, and here he played the move bishop d4, which was well intended and it actually helped him to win the game, but it would have been safer to put the knight on d4. We will come to that. At this point, white played c3, bishop c5, but in this blitz game, it was a blitz game, but even so it was very interesting. White omitted this idea that we talked about, f takes, and after f takes, knight h6. This would have led to the winner of the exchange for white, so they would have good winning chances. I think even there is some idea like rook f7, but okay, most probably this is what white should go for, or perhaps even take the pawn. In any case, black would be in difficulties here. So after king h1, bishop d4 is well intended, but it doesn't solve black's problems here because white's knight is very strong. The same goes for the move d4. We should not play this because again we have the same situation that white would play like this and they would bring the knight to f7. So having said that, what do you think black should play? Is there a way in which we can exploit the potential pin along the h3, c8 diagonal? That's right. We should use the knight for this purpose, knight d4. As you can see, now white cannot use the knight in the same way because there is also a pin directed at their queen. So this would have been a good move for black. If bishop takes, we can just take back, and they don't have the same potential as in the other variations. We could perhaps even play something like g6 later on to start to push back white's pieces. So after knight e4, what white could play here, they could try f takes e5, insisting with this idea of knight h6. However, now that the bishop is not looking at e5 anymore, we could keep the f file closed, so we could take with the rook instead. And as you can see, black is close to trading off pieces here with knight takes f5 after, let's say, rook e1. Black would play something like king h8, and I think at this point we're already interested in playing g6 because that pawn is not pinned anymore. It's actually white who is slightly troubled in this position, I think. You can also see that if they take on d5 at any moment, there is a problem with this knight, and also the queen could come to d5. So black would be okay here. It's good for them that the f file remains fairly closed. So interesting example. White had all the pieces in the battle, in the attack. There were many ways to go wrong here. For example, if you take on e4, white would definitely take on e5 in order to help their bishop to become even stronger. This would be very unpleasant. However, we have this nice little idea of giving check and then putting the knight on d4 where it obstructs white's bishop along the long diagonal. So nice idea, trying to restrict the opponent's attack. Let's have another look at another example where black did basically the same thing. They are again obstructing the enemy fianchetto bishop, but they are doing it in terms of a sacrifice. Well, in order to understand this, first we should try to see what white is up to here. In this very strange position, you could say, white is a piece down, if I'm not mistaken, but black's king is weak, but also you can see that black's rooks are in funny places. What to do here with black? At first, please notice that white is actually threatening to give mate in 2 moves. You can see that, right? That's right. This bishop is really powerful. The only piece which is obstructing it right now is the knight on f6. So white would be very happy to play rook g4 check, so that after knight takes g4, they will mate black with queen g7. So that's the big risk here, the big danger for black. And in the game, by the way, we have with the white pieces Sipke Ernst and playing black Craig Hanley. Hanley noticed this threat, of course, and he hurried to play here the move Yeah, very pretty move, I must say, rook b2. Because in this way, we obstruct the bishop on a1, and not only that, if they take, of course, our passed pawn becomes even stronger. So this is a nice move to take into account. There were other ways to obstruct the bishop. You could also consider the move e5, for example. But I like this move very much. The rook wasn't doing that much anyway, and if we're the piece up, we can definitely give back something, right? So rook b2 was played in the game. If white takes, there is not much going on here. The attack is basically over. So in the game, Ernst instead tried bishop takes c6, and after queen takes c6, he played rook cd1. This is the right approach when you're in difficulties. Try to cook up something, try to put up maximal resistance. You can see that now there are some ideas with rook d8 at some point. For example, if black is taking now on c5 with the queen, that would be a terrible blunder due to rook d8, and black is basically mated here. But that didn't happen, of course. Hanley knew the danger, he sensed the danger, and he took with a rook on c5 instead, so that the queen helps the knight to interpose on e8 if necessary. And definitely we should not move away this rook, because in that case there would be mating pictures with queen g7 at some point. So the rook should just stay there forever. We have to neutralize the bishop. And you can see that also we have ideas such as rook d5 trading pieces. Yeah, what happened here? Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen d2. Not clear what white is up to here. Rook b5, one of several good moves. Rook b1 and knight e4, and black went on to win. Nice example, not very difficult, but very practical, I would say. Rook b2, it's definitely worth an exchange to neutralize that bishop along the a1, h8 diagonal. This is something that you don't have to calculate too much, which is nice at move 33, as in this game, for example, when we're perhaps in time trouble. Find a practical solution like that with minimal calculation required. All right, let's continue. My next example, it's much more complex. Wow, yeah, this is a crazy game. Just look at this position. We are, by the way, seeing here Duda with the white pieces and Dubov playing black. Yeah, two of the world's best players. You can see that both of them, I mean, they went all in here in this example. Duda is having a material advantage, perhaps you could say, and he also has these passed pawns, no, very powerful passed pawns. But at the same time, black has dangerous threats. You can see that bishop takes d3 might come up at some point, and definitely white should not take on h4, because in that case Dubov has prepared queen f3. So we should be very careful here in this position, and there is a nice move that white can use in order to neutralize the bishop on c6. It's rather similar to the previous example, just that it's a more, what can I say, more complex position. So what Duda played here, since you know the topic of obstructing enemy pieces, what Duda played here was the move rook d5. Very nice move. You have to understand something about the relative value of the pieces to play a move like that. The bishop on c6 was simply very, very strong. There were some pitfalls here. For example, if we play a move like f4, yeah, this is a bad move, of course, because black would then actually, yeah, they would kill us here with rook takes and queen takes mate. So that's a terrible move. But yeah, another move that I think some student proposed here was e8. This is what we will come to in the next chapter, distraction. We can use our pieces to distract opponents from their attack, but on this occasion the price would be rather high, because these passed pawns are very strong, so we shouldn't give them away like that. Black could take, and after I think d7 we could play something like rook g8. Please notice that the bishop is keeping track of the d8 square, so this would not make sense. We should rather keep those pawns unless there is a clear benefit from giving them away. So back to the game. Rook d5 was played by Duda. It actually doesn't win the game. It's just a very good defensive move. He won the game, but objectively it's still about equal, says Duda. I was checking his annotations for this game, and he explains, for example, that black could have played bishop g5, and he gave a very funny variation here, which I wanted to share with you. He says that white can now take on g5, black can not take with the knight, of course, it's pins. After rook takes, now they lost track of the pawn, so we can queen, and after e8, queen, bishop takes, queen takes, rook g8, white could play d7. What a funny position. I would think that white is better in practical terms, but engine-wise, after queen d4, black is holding in this position. Yeah, strange game. Rook e1, rook f8, rook e3. That's where Duda's variation finishes. I'm not sure completely I understand this position, but it was supposed to be equal. So, all right, not very obvious to see this with black. What Dubov played in the game was much more, you could say, natural. He took on d5, bishop takes d5, and after queen takes d5. This is the moment where black went wrong, because what they should have tried here was something like bishop takes e7, trying to get rid of at least one of the pawns and then put the rook on e8. Looks still troublesome for black, but after queen f7, I think you can go knight f6 and Duda show that black is okay here, bringing the queen to e5, but definitely easier said than done. Easy to see this when you move the pieces and you analyze and so on, but when you sit there at the board, this is, yeah, really painstaking. So not surprising that Dubov lost control here, played knight f6. I would like to ask you, what do you think white should play here? That's right. We have this very powerful passed pawn, so we could even carry out a new sacrifice. Queen takes, you got it, g8. Very surprising move, very pretty. After king takes g8, white would just play d7. A beautiful picture. You can see that black is very much ahead in material, but they cannot avoid white from queening, which means that white would have the upper hand. At some point, I think this bishop would just leave the board. So in the game, Duda took with a knight instead, and Dubov took with a knight, and Duda played e8 queen, and white later went on to win. It's still unpleasant for black. By now it's probably the black king which is most exposed, more exposed here from the two kings. So yeah, extremely complex example, but what we should notice here is that black had bishop takes g3 coming up, and white said that it's definitely worth it to give away the exchange in order to neutralize black's attack, specifically the bishop on c6. All right, let's have a look at our last example. So far we have seen mainly the pieces being used for this purpose of obstructing the enemy pieces, but I wanted to show you one example where we're also using the pawns. So this is a typical position from the Queen's Indian. It can also occur in the Bogo Indian. You can see that black is playing for an attack. They have used this typical rook lift in order to start aggressive operations on the king side. Queen h4, evidently, it's a clear threat here. White should be very careful. There is, for example, this famous pitfall. If you play g3, you lose the game instantly. Aha, that's right. Queen h4, nice little tactical trick. If pawn takes its mate here after rook g6 on the next move. So yeah, white should be careful here. You can also see that there is even an idea with bishop takes g2, king takes, and then queen g5 check, so that if the king goes back to h1, then black could play something like queen h4, and they would have a mating attack. So white should be extremely careful. One last piece of advice: don't play h3, because in that case white will actually face exactly this sacrifice. And again, we have the situation that I'm talking about. Black is attacking on the g file and the h file. Next move probably queen h4, and this pawn is doomed. No, so many things to think of here. But if you look at it in a more general perspective, you would say that this is my main enemy, the bishop on b7. It's always there in all the tactical variations. It's an important ingredient of black's attack. And there is a simple way in which we can neutralize this bishop. If you're playing regularly with white, the Queen's Indian or the Bogo Indian, you know about this trick, of course. That's right, strategically a very well-founded move. You can see that we are obstructing black's bishop, and we're opening up for our own bishop. So this is a very nice move, which solves most of white's problems here. In the game, by the way, with the white pieces Dienstuhl and playing black Buntsman, black played here an interesting move, b5. I like this approach. Black knows that they have to play actively. If you just wait here, white will be better thanks to the bishop pair and this very strong bishop. If you play something like e5, you can imagine that at some point white will play f4. I have personal memories of this kind of position. We will actually come to this much later in the course. This kind of structure, you can see that this bishop has no rival. No, it has no, there is no opposing bishop. So this will be very troublesome for black, and their bishop is bad. So I like the move that Buntsman played in the game. After d5, he tried b5 in order to insist with controlling the long diagonal with the bishop. But even so, white has the sounder position here. They played c takes b5, and after bishop takes d5, another important pawn move. We're talking about the dangers on the king side, so white's next move here is not very difficult. Of course, we use the f3 pawn to neutralize this bishop. You could say obstruct it or restrict it, whichever word you like the most. The important thing is to understand that by this little move, we don't let them exert as much pressure as before. Black tried in the game queen h4, white played h3, and as you can see, we're ready to move the king next turn, so that if they play, for example, rook g6, we could play king h1, thereby preventing this queen takes h3, and white could perhaps later on try to bring the queen to the defense. So white would probably be better here. It seems that they can resist the attack. In the game, black tried instead queen g3, and at this point, something interesting happened here, because white played king h1, which is basically a draw for now, because black could take on h3 and then it would be a draw. But black didn't want that, and they played for a win instead. So interesting. We're back on the topic that we talked about in chapter 5, that sometimes it can be a draw, but if the opponent doesn't want to draw, they are then risking. But objectively speaking, white could have played this move instead. I suppose that Dinstall didn't play like that because he didn't want to give away the pawn here. However, it's a small price to give away a pawn, because now we have managed to neutralize black's attack. And as you can see on the queen side, it's not only about the king side, right? There is a queen side also. Now white can start playing on this side, so something like rook c1, targeting this pawn. Maybe we can then double up the rooks and so on. This would be very unpleasant for black. This is a big weakness, the c7 pawn. So yeah, queen e1, that was a good move. If black plays queen g5 instead, targeting the pawn on e3, we could play this, what I call smart defense. That is a specific chapter on this topic, very interesting. King h1, smart defense, in the sense that if queen takes e3, we would then have bishop c1 with a nice skewer. So after king h1, black would have to play something else instead, perhaps knight f6, trying to bring the knight to the attack. But white would be okay here. We could play something like queen f2, and after knight h5, simply king h2, so that we don't run into any forks on g3. So still it would be a fightable position. Black could perhaps play something like rook g6, but white is okay here. I think at some point we could resume the play on the queen side with rook ac1. So what was this example about? Basically, that bishop was very powerful on b7. White should take the opportunity here to play d5 as soon as possible, so that black doesn't get a chance to sacrifice on g2 and so on. So very important resource for white in this kind of structure. All right, that was the last example. If we do a quick recap here, we saw in our first example that white's queen was very dangerous, so black should hurry to bring the queen to obstruct white's queen along the g-file. In our second example, we saw that white's attack was extremely dangerous. They went on to win this game, but black could have fought back here with a sacrifice. Knight g4 was a very strong move in order to obstruct the rook, and if white takes with the pawn, we could then play queen g5, again obstructing white, this time on the c1 h6 diagonal. We saw Bent Larsen's famous battle against Mark Taimadov. This is, yeah, unforgettable, I would say, this example. It's just fantastic, so I have to play out the moves again. f6, knight e4, f takes e5, queen g3, and here the fantastic move. If you have seen it once, I think you never forget it. Bishop g4, a genius move. What black is doing here, they're giving away the bishop so that white's queen can't take on e5 anymore, which means that the king is now perfectly safe on h8. We saw the interesting battle between Bagdasaryan and Gabusyan, where black was trying to mate white on the h5, but white hurried to play this tricky move, bishop d7, bringing in the bishop to h3, relying on a tactical motive on the e8 square. We had another interesting example where black was trying to mate white on the h-file again, and white found a dramatic way to temporarily obstruct black's rook on the h-file by taking and then playing the move rook h4 to win a tempo for their own counter-attack. Yeah, very nice. Nice solution by Leon Valdez in this game. We saw the typical, you could say, standard procedure here: trade on c3 and put the bishop on e4. in Petrosian spirit, trading off white's most prominent bishop, the light square bishop in this IQP structure. Very important method. We saw a similar situation where black did the same thing, but this time on the dark squares in order to limit the powerful fianchetto bishop on b2. Something similar happened in our next example. We used the rook for the same purpose. Rook b2, please don't be too materialistic. When defending, it can be worth to give up exchange to rule out any mating ideas such as rook g4, knight takes d4, and queen g7 mates. We had a look at this amazing example, rook d5, a very pretty move, possible only if we understand the relative value of the pieces. This bishop was extremely powerful, so it's worth exchange to trade it off, so to speak. And we had a look at this Queen's Indian or Bogo Indian example where white played d5 in order to limit black's bishop on b7. All right, that's it. Thanks a lot and see you in the next chapter.